This is Afghanistan, and what we need is this spot right on the border with China. The Taliban cut a route through the mountains and made it all the way to the Chinese border. For nearly 80 years, this region lived in isolation, without proper trade or stable links to the outside world, and now the Taliban have finally reached China because for them, this is a chance to open a door to the wider world. To put it in context, Afghanistan is landlocked and depends on its neighbors, their borders, and their routes. It can't trade smoothly because crossings are regularly shut down, conflicts flare up, and trade comes to a halt almost immediately. So in order to pull this region out of decades of isolation, they quite literally carved a road through the mountains to the Chinese border. And when they finally reached it, it seemed like everything was about to change. But then China did something no one expected. Let's clear something up right away. So what exactly is keeping this place from becoming part of the wider development trend? On paper, the territory is open, so over time, roads, communications, and trade should reach it. Maybe not immediately, but eventually, right? That's usually how infrastructure works. It gradually pushes into places where there's at least some chance of building something, but here the problem is different. Nature itself is firmly against it. Why do you think this area is not developing? We don't need any of that. All your progress and all that. We lived without it before and we were just fine. This narrow Afghan corridor is literally wedged between three massive mountain systems: the Pamirs, the Karakoram, and the Hindu Kush. There's extreme altitude, harsh cold, and terrain so difficult that any construction project turns into an ordeal. And that's why the region remains one of the most inaccessible places on the planet to this day. Even in the most difficult mountain systems, some kinds of roads usually appear sooner or later, even if they're just trails, dirt tracks, or routes that can only be used during certain seasons. Yes, they're inconvenient and sometimes dangerous, but that's usually how everything begins. Because without the movement of people and goods, no economy can function. If there's at least some link to the outside world, even a minimal one, a region gradually starts to improve. But here the situation was different. For a long time, there were not even basic paths. For decades in the Wakhan corridor, there was no stable route that people could regularly use for travel, or at least walking, not once a year, not by chance, but on a consistent basis. In the end, this place was simply cut off from the rest of the country. But then another question comes up. How can people even live in a place like this? There are no roads, no reliable communication, none of the usual comforts. So life there naturally narrows down to the bare essentials: finding food, securing shelter, surviving the cold and the wind. It's hard to talk about development there in the usual sense because in a way, it never even really begins. We already have self-driving taxis. Soon we'll have flying ones. And after that, give it a little more time and we'll get teleporters. Or at least someone will invent warp drives. Steve, are you serious? Maybe you could help instead. That's why people in the Wakhan corridor live very differently from the rest of the country. They're small, scattered groups that rarely come into contact with one another. Villages can be far apart with no permanent connection between them. Many people are not tied to one place at all. They move with their herds, adjusting to pasture land and the weather. Their lives depend almost entirely on nature and the changing seasons. But then the bigger question is why, after so many years, did this region never become part of the country's broader development? Normally, if a territory belongs to a state, at least the basics begin to arrive little by little: roads, supplies, some form of administration. Even the most remote areas are eventually drawn into the national economy, because that's what the state's supposed to do. But for many years, the Wakhan corridor was effectively cut off from the outside world. There were no stable routes and no constant ties. Contact with the rest of the country remained weak and irregular. And without that, it's impossible to build anything long-term. No construction, no trade, no proper governance. The region lived on its own. Whatever happened there happened separately from the rest of the country. The real question is, how long can that kind of isolation go on before it starts to feel normal? Because sometimes a region gets cut off for a while because of weather, conflict, or just difficult geography. But usually, sooner or later, those problems get solved. Roads are built, trade resumes, and links gradually come back. But when it drags on for decades, that's a completely different story. Isolation stops being seen as a temporary problem. It becomes permanent, settles in, and starts shaping everything. the economy, daily life, and the way people build their whole existence. The Wakan Corridor stayed isolated for almost 80 years. 80 years! My grandma's younger than that. So after many years having no real links to the outside world started to feel normal. People there have long accepted that this is just how life works in the region. But how did the region become so isolated in the first place? Was it always like this? Did it happen over time? Or did something go wrong? I don't know, maybe the mountains shifted. Some kind of flood? Because just being tucked between mountains doesn't automatically make a place a dead end. In fact, places like that often become natural corridors because they're useful for connecting different regions. Historically, that was exactly the case here. Important trade routes were often laid through difficult terrain, and the Wakan Corridor once played precisely that role. Those were the good old days. The corridor was part of the ancient caravan network known as the Silk Road, linking Central Asia with China. In ancient times, that made it extremely important and highly valuable. But over time, everything changed. The main trade flows began shifting to routes that were easier, faster, and safer. And little by little, this route started losing its importance. At some point, it simply dropped out of the main network. It stopped being part of the larger movement of trade and gradually became what we see today, an isolated territory that no longer plays the role it once did. At first, isolation might seem like nothing more than an inconvenience. Yes, it's far away, hard to reach, and uncomfortable. But that's not the case when it affects your life every single day. If a region has no normal, stable connection to the outside world, its economy never really gets off the ground. People don't even have access to basic things like medical care. In conditions like that, people can't plan for the future, they can't improve their lives. Everything's reduced to the bare minimum. Survive today and somehow make it to tomorrow. That's why the corridor remains one of the poorest and most underdeveloped parts of the country. And even by Afghan standards, living conditions here are extremely harsh. People may have to borrow food from neighbors because they don't have enough of their own. In winter, some walk barefoot. Even though the cold there is severe, housing's often very basic, mud homes without electricity, running water, or proper furniture. In other words, it's brutal. So naturally, that leads to the question, what can actually change the situation in a region that has lived in this kind of isolation for decades? Without roads, any talk of development's meaningless. No routes means no movement. Every connection with the outside world begins with roads. First come at least simple paths, and then, little by little, everything else follows. Over time, that became obvious to Afghanistan as well. At some point, the authorities finally decided to seriously focus on the Wakan Corridor. But deciding's one thing. You still have to actually do something. Usually, building a road is seen as a straightforward technical task. If you have the resources and enough time, it'll get done sooner or later. Under normal conditions, that's basically how it works. There's machinery, there's communication, materials can be delivered, and if something goes wrong, help can arrive quickly. But when you're dealing with extreme terrain, the difficulty level jumps straight to hard mode. At that point, it's not just construction anymore. It's basically a fight for survival. Except in your case, the wind is also blowing the asphalt away. In the Wakan Corridor, workers have to deal with altitude, freezing temperatures, and the near total lack of modern equipment. On top of that, the country remains fairly closed off, so there aren't many details available. But the basics are clear. There's no communication, the terrain is incredibly difficult, and even clean water is in short supply. Most importantly, if someone gets injured or falls ill, it can take several days to reach proper medical care. And injuries on construction sites are about as common as it gets. Damn, I cut myself. Do we have a bandage?
Nope.
And what do we do to clean the wound with?
Nothing.
So what do we have?
A mountain?
That's it?
No. There's another one over there.
There's another factor that makes road construction here even harder and drags the whole process out. At high altitude, it's not just the terrain itself that causes problems, the environment does too. The elevation takes a toll on people physically, machinery performs worse, and the weather constantly gets in the way. If you've ever climbed a seriously high mountain, you know exactly what I mean. In the Wakan Corridor, all of this is especially intense, and it's not just because of the elevation. In winter, the region's almost completely cut off. Heavy snowfall and extreme cold simply block the passes. Working in those conditions is nearly impossible. Summer's a little easier, but not by much. The narrow mountain sections don't go anywhere. They're still difficult to cross and just as hard to build through. So in the end, the entire project depends on a short window each year when conditions are at least good enough to make progress. The rest of the time, the work either slows to a crawl or stops altogether. And now try squeezing something like a dump truck into that tiny window. So how do you build a road through a place where there are barely any natural passages at all? When the route runs into sheer rock, you can't go around it. There are more walls of stone on every side. Normally, people would just look for an easier route, but here, there's no easier route. Or a harder one for that matter. There are no routes at all, which leaves only one option: go straight through the obstacle. And that's basically what's happening in the Wakan corridor. Workers are cutting the road through the mountains, breaking rock, widening narrow sections, sometimes working almost by hand, sometimes with only minimal machinery. It's an incredibly slow and punishing process. Every foot comes at a cost, because the road has to be carved directly out of stone. So maybe it's not worth putting this much effort into a road that leads to one of the most remote corners of the country. But if the project is this difficult, this slow, and this dangerous, then clearly there's more behind it than just a desire to make life a little easier for a few far-off settlements. And that's exactly why this road is seen as an important route. Through the Wakan corridor, Afghanistan is trying to break out of its geographic isolation, reconnect with outside markets, and reshape the position of the entire country. Oddly enough, the project has already moved beyond the earliest stage. By 2024, about 30 miles of road had been completed, roughly 40% of the total plan. And let me remind you, the conditions out there are brutal, and they don't even have modern equipment on site. But can you really change the fate of a region that's been cut off from the outside world for so long, and do it with just one road? Actually, once a stable route appears, things start to change little by little. As soon as goods can be transported, some level of economic activity begins. Even a simple road can become the foundation for trade and connect a place that used to be isolated to neighboring countries. That's the basic idea. If the road is completed, the route could bypass Pakistan and shorten the way between Central Asia and China. And that gives it a completely different level of importance. It would also create potential for transporting resources like lithium, cobalt, and gold. Those materials are in high demand on the global market right now, so the region could, in theory, end up holding a winning ticket. That raises another question. Why choose a route like this at all if it's so difficult both to build and to use? Usually, roads are laid where there are fewer obstacles, where it's easier, cheaper, and safer. So if they're choosing this particular stretch, convenience clearly isn't the reason. It's hard to imagine any construction worker actually loving extra hardship, just for the sheer joy of suffering. Everything comes down to geography. The Wakan corridor matters because of where it sits on the map. It's a very narrow strip of land that effectively connects Afghanistan to an eastern high-altitude region, and there are almost no alternatives. There simply are no other direct routes. What are these people doing over there?
Chopping up a mountain to build a road.
Can they not just climb over it? Losers. And they call themselves the pinnacle of evolution. That's why people don't look at it as just another road. They see it as a rare opportunity, a natural outlet that could, at least in theory, connect the country to the outside world. But it'd be nice to understand why they're betting on this route specifically instead of using the routes that already exist. The answer is actually pretty simple. If a new road is shorter or faster, it can change the usual transportation patterns because, naturally, everyone benefits from spending less time and less money. Companies as well as entire countries are constantly looking for options like that, where delivery is faster, where moving cargo is cheaper, and then there's the Wakan corridor, a more direct overland route between parts of Asia and the West. Practically a gift to global trade. It could make it possible to avoid some of the long maritime routes, which in turn would reduce dependence on ports and shipping lanes. That's what makes it such an attractive alternative. Looking at the bigger picture, this isn't just about improving life in an extremely remote region. Once goods start moving through a country's territory, that country gains more than just access to markets. It also earns money from the transit. New opportunities open up for trade, jobs, investment, and business growth, even if the country doesn't have many resources of its own. Shifts like that can change a country's standing as a whole. And honestly, being a transit point's a status symbol in its own right. You become a place where routes and money pass through. And with that, the country gradually becomes part of a much larger economic system.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
A transit hub. Right. We should probably cut back on his YouTube. At first, it may seem like the hardest part's already done, and all that's left is to bring everything to its logical conclusion. The roadwork is gradually nearing completion, so it would seem the only thing left is to connect this brand new road to outside routes and open it to traffic. But in the case of the Wakhan corridor, everything comes down to that final stretch where the road reaches the state border. And that's where it suddenly turns out that Afghanistan's not the only country this project depends on. You can build the best road on Earth, but its real value depends on what happens on the other side of the border. If the crossing never opens and the route doesn't continue beyond it, the whole story simply ends at the border. So in the end, everything comes down to the border, even though the road itself should, in theory, be good for trade. If the route really shortens distances and creates new connections, you'd expect the neighboring country to be interested too, and to support the project. In situations like this, countries usually open border crossings, agree on the rules, and start moving goods. But here, something clearly feels off. China's not only in no hurry to make a decision, but it's also not making any noticeable moves in that direction. On the section where the road's supposed to reach the border, there's not even basic infrastructure for crossing. There's no proper checkpoint, and there are no signs that one will be built anytime soon. To me, this looks like a pretty blunt hint. When a country's not interested in contact, it doesn't leave the border open. It does the opposite, trying to control it as tightly as possible and limit any movement. And on the Chinese side, where the road reaches the Wakhan corridor, there are very real barriers in place. The area is reinforced with a long green fence and several rows of barbed wire. What's that? The border for trade. Then why the barbed wire? It's a decoration. On top of that, the whole area is monitored by cameras, so this isn't just a difficult crossing. Without permission, it's essentially impossible. In short, there's no such thing as free passage here. At first glance, it may seem strange to fortify a border so heavily in a place where there are hardly any people or movement. The area already seems secure. It's remote, empty, and rarely used. But here the issue's not how many people are around, but the region with which this border is connected. In this case, we're talking about Xinjiang. And for China, that's a highly sensitive region in security terms. The authorities fear that terrorists or separatists could cross the border there. Even a small, purely theoretical risk is taken very seriously. So the preferred approach is maximum restriction. Better to ban everything than deal with the consequences later. As a result, any contact is kept to an absolute minimum, and the border remains under full control. The bigger picture becomes even clearer once you look at when and why this passage stopped functioning in the first place. Routes like this don't usually disappear on their own, especially when they've existed for centuries and linked entire regions. Closing one takes a deliberate political decision. In the case of the Wakhan corridor, that's exactly what happened. Its isolation is directly tied to China's actions. After Mao Zedong came to power in 1949, the border was completely shut down. That decision effectively cut off an ancient caravan route that had functioned for roughly 2,000 years, linking Central Asia with China. From that point on, the corridor stopped serving as a route for trade and movement. Instead of being a transit passage, it became a dead end. No respect for tradition. The situation looks odd. The road's being built, resources are being spent, yet the border remains closed. Normally, when one country invests in infrastructure like this, it expects the neighboring country to meet it halfway. And believe it or not, Afghanistan really did try to resolve this from its side. The authorities in Kabul repeatedly approached China with requests to open a crossing through the Wakhan corridor. They framed it in economic terms, arguing that it could benefit both sides and proposing the route as an alternative supply corridor. But the Chinese side consistently refused and over all these years never changed its position. But something here doesn't add up. After all, China's been actively pushing the Belt and Road Initiative, building new routes and expanding trade ties across the world. On the surface, a corridor like this seems as though it would fit naturally into that strategy, practically a gift. But when decisions are made about whether a route should be included in projects like these, it's not just about whether it's shorter or more convenient. They also look at risk, stability, and how much control they would have over the situation, and a whole range of other factors. And that's where the Wakhan corridor starts to look much less attractive. From China's perspective, it's simply too unpredictable and too vulnerable. The difficult geography, weak infrastructure, and proximity to unstable regions make it a risky option. But maybe this is not only about politics or security. Maybe the economics of the project itself are also part of the problem. Even if a road can technically be built, that alone's not enough. It has to generate real value, otherwise no one will keep using it in the long run. And the costs here are enormous. Building a road in such conditions is hard enough, but maintaining it afterward is even harder. Constant repairs, harsh weather, difficult terrain, all of that costs money. And that money has to come back somehow through trade and transit. So it's not hard to see why many experts doubt that the Wakhan corridor can really deliver that, especially since the potential cargo volume appears to be fairly limited, while the route itself is too difficult to use efficiently. In the end, the economic return may be quite low, and that leaves the main question unanswered. Can this project actually function on a meaningful scale, or will it end up serving mostly local people? Overall, this is a strange situation. The road seems to have almost reached its goal. All that's left is to connect it to the other side and open the route to traffic. But instead, everything has slowed to a crawl. The last stretch runs through an especially difficult section of mountainous terrain where construction becomes far more challenging, progress slows down, and every foot comes at a price. In the end, the road simply stops, ending less than 0.6 miles short of the Chinese border. So everything stalled, despite all the work that had already been done. And that's because a route like this requires the consent of both countries. If even one side's not willing, what chance does the project really have? Even if the road is fully completed, that alone doesn't really fix the problem. Without access to the border and the ability to cross it, it can't serve its main purpose. So the road ends up staying inside the country, like an isolated piece of infrastructure. The potential may be there, but there's no real way to use it. But can such a road still make any difference by itself, even if it doesn't connect to anything beyond the country? Usually, when new infrastructure appears, people expect it to have at least some effect within the region itself to start functioning and delivering some kind of benefit. But here, what matters is the kind of road it is and what it's actually capable of. In the case of the Wakhan corridor, we're not talking about a full-scale highway. It's not a paved route, but essentially a dirt road without a hard surface. You can travel along it to some extent, but it's poorly suited for heavy cargo and regular trade. In the end, even within the country, its usefulness remains very limited. Still, I guess even a dirt road's better than no road at all. What do you think? And by the way, is it even realistic to expect that this road will eventually be upgraded to a proper standard? Usually, if a project is truly important, it gets improved step by step. The surface is reinforced, bridges are built, and the route is made reliable enough for year-round travel. Instead of only working under perfect conditions, every third Tuesday of the month as long as there's no rain and the moon is in the right phase. But the Wakhan corridor is still far from that point. The dirt road depends heavily on the weather. In some places, it gets washed out, in others, it becomes too slippery to pass. And there's another problem too. Parts of the route rely on temporary river crossings. When the water's low, they can still be used. But as soon as the level rises, that's it, unless you plan to swim across. All right, first the mountain switchbacks, then 2 tunnels. They're not finished, so we have to do a bit of digging.
And what's this?
A river.
So how are we supposed to cross it?
On beavers. All right, there's still some work to be done. But has life actually become at least a little easier for people since the road appeared at all? Connection to the outside world should already be bringing at least some benefits, and you can feel that in the Wakhan corridor too. It's become easier to deliver the most basic necessities more quickly: flour, cooking oil, and other supplies. That's an improvement over the way things used to be, but the overall changes are still pretty limited. The road exists, but it doesn't solve everything. On the one hand, it draws more attention from the state to the region. On the other, it creates a new kind of uncertainty. People still don't fully understand what comes next. Although, to be fair, things weren't exactly clear before either. The main question remains, can a single road really change the fate of a region, or will its impact stay limited? Because a road alone doesn't count as development. If goods can't move further onward and nothing new is coming in from outside, the economy starts circling within itself. At some point, it simply hits a ceiling and stops growing. That's probably exactly what'll happen with the Wakhan corridor. The road may now exist, but the border's still closed. As a result, the route exists only as a theoretical possibility on paper, not as a real channel for movement. So instead of an economic boost, you end up with an economic flop. That leads to another question. Is there any real chance that China could eventually change its position and open the border? In theory, yes, that does happen. in international politics, decisions are not always permanent. When interests shift or new incentives appear, policy can be reconsidered. Sometimes economic projects themselves help push governments toward easing restrictions. But in this case, the issue's not really about economics. For China, this section is primarily a security matter, not a trade one. As long as the risks there are seen as serious, nothing's likely to change. Even the potential economic upside of the road won't be enough to tip the balance. Unless that upside were somehow measured in trillions, and even then I wouldn't bet on it. So yes, the possibility of change exists, but under current conditions, it looks extremely low. In the end, after all those years of work and expectation, the whole story lands in a strangely anticlimactic place. The road was built, but it never actually connected to the outside world. A huge amount of effort went into it, and the result was basically nothing. As long as the border stays closed, movement never really begins, and the entire project loses its meaning as a transit route, which was the whole point from the start. So in the end, the Wakhan corridor remains almost as isolated as it was before, and yet a lot was still accomplished. The Afghan side managed to cut through the mountains and create a route where none had existed for decades, but they couldn't do anything about an obstacle of a different kind. This was no longer about cliffs, cold, or brutal terrain. It was a political decision. And unlike a mountain, you can't just carve your way through it. You owe me a like. See you later.